Russia. Goes to you, 2 minutes, Senator Obama. How do you see the relationship with Russia? Do you see him as a competitor? Do you see him as an enemy? Do you see him as a potential partner?
Well, I think that given what's happened over the last several weeks and months, our entire Russian approach has to be evaluated, because a resurgent and very aggressive Russia is a threat to the peace and stability of the region. Their actions in Georgia were unacceptable. They were unwarranted, and at this point it is absolutely critical for the next president to make clear that we have to follow through on our six-point ceasefire. They have to remove themselves from South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It is absolutely important that we have a unified alliance, and that we explain to the Russians that you cannot be a 21st century superpower or power and act like a 20th century dictatorship. And we also have to affirm all the fledgling democracies in that region. The Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Poles, the Czechs, that we are in fact going to be supportive and in solidarity with them in their efforts. They are members of NATO, and to countries like Georgia and the Ukraine, I think we have to insist that they are free to join NATO if they meet the requirements, and they should have a membership action plan immediately to start bringing them in. Now, we also can't return to a Cold War posture with respect to Russia. It's important that we recognize there are going to be some areas of common interest. One is nuclear proliferation. They have not only 15,000 nuclear warheads, but they've got enough to make another 40,000, and some of those loose nukes could fall into the hands of al-Qaeda. This is an area where I've led on in the Senate, working with a Republican ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Dick Lugar, to deal with the proliferation of loose nuclear weapons. That's an area where we're going to have to work with Russia, but we have to have a president who is clear that you don't deal with Russia based on staring into his eyes and seeing his soul. You deal with Russia based on what are the national security interests of the United States of America, and we have to recognize that the way they've been behaving lately demands a sharp response from the international community and our allies.
2 minutes on Russia, Senator McCain.
Well, I was interested in Senator Obama's reaction to the Russian aggression against Georgia. His first statement was, both sides ought to show restraint. Again, a little bit of naivete there. He doesn't understand that Russia committed serious aggression against Georgia. And Russia has now become a nation fueled by petrodollars that is basically a KGB apparatchik-run government. I looked into Mr. Putin's eyes, and I saw 3 letters, a K, a G, and a B. And their aggression in Georgia is not acceptable behavior. I don't believe we're going to go back to the Cold War. I am sure that that will not happen. But I do believe that we need to bolster our friends and allies. And that wasn't just about a problem between Georgia and Russia. It had everything to do with energy. There's a pipeline that runs from the Caspian through Georgia through Turkey. And of course, we know that the Russians control other sources of energy into Europe, which they have used from time to time. It's not accidental that the presidents of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine flew to Georgia, flew to Tbilisi, where I have spent a significant amount of time with a great young president, Misha Saakashvili. And they showed solidarity with them, but also they are very concerned about the Russian threats to regain their status of the old Russian Empire. Now, I think the Russians ought to understand that we will support, we, the United States, will support the inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine and the natural process, inclusion into NATO. We also ought to make it very clear that the Russians are in violation of their ceasefire agreement. They have stationed additional troops in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. By the way, I went there once, and we went inside and drove in, and there was a huge poster. And this is Georgian territory, and there was a huge picture of Vladimir Putin, and it said, Vladimir Putin, our president. It was very clear the Russian intentions towards Georgia. They were just waiting to seize the opportunity. So this is a very difficult situation. We want to work with the Russians, but but we also have every right to expect the Russians to behave in a fashion in keeping with a country who respects international boundaries and the norms of international behavior. And watch Ukraine. This whole thing has got a lot to do with Ukraine, Crimea, the base of the Russian fleet in Sevastopol, and the breakdown of the political process in Ukraine between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko is a very serious problem. So watch Ukraine, and let's make sure that the Ukrainians understand that we are their friend and ally.
Do you have a major difference with what he just said?
Vice President Dick Cheney drew up a list of 60 countries that were supposed to be the enemies of the people of our country. Well, of course, I disagree with that list. But both the Democrat and the Republicans now want to add China and Russia to the list. Russia is no more an enemy of this country, but there are some who want it to become an enemy. And so what they've done is they've decided that NATO, which in my opinion should be dissolved as part of our peace dividend for winning the Cold War, they believe that NATO's membership should be moved right up to the Russian border. And so that the United States then would be engaged in a military pact that requires our country to come to the military defense of any country that felt itself threatened by any other country, including Russia. Now, of course, we know that World War I started as a result of a miscalculation involving a very small country. In the age of mutual assured destruction, it is madness for the United States to engage in this type of provocation. In addition to that, the placement of a missile shield in Eastern Europe is also a direct provocation to the leadership of Russia. The United States should stand for peace and diplomacy. We have many, many things that we can offer the world other than saber rattling and gunboat diplomacy. I think we should try to extend the arm of peace, handshake, of friendship, rather than transfers of military technology that in the end will indeed be used. The question is, against whom?